Welcome, and thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Chief Operating Officer. We have an excellent speaker today with a timely local story. If you ever look around at the world's problems and think to yourself, I'm just one person, what can I do? Today's presentation is for you. Our CEO, Dee Simon, was quoted in the Seattle Times last week saying, "If I had to sum it up, what I want the public to understand is that you can be pro-Israel and you can be pro-Palestinian and you can be against Hamas all at the same time." It has been over a month since the brutal attack from Hamas on Israel, and the horrors continue to unfold. The loss of innocent civilians in Israel and Gaza, more than 200 hostages still being held captive, and the alarming surge of anti-Semitism around the world, especially on college campuses. At the Holocaust Center, we respond by doing more of what we do best. We educate. We redouble our efforts, committing to being a source for people of all ages, backgrounds, and religions to turn to for reliable information, resources, and skills. In the wake of the Israel-Hamas war, here is what we are doing at the Holocaust Center. We are empowering upstanders, lifting up people who are breaking boundaries, looking past stereotypes, and stepping into the uncomfortable to help others. Stay tuned for more of these stories on our social media channels. We are promoting media literacy, sharpening our skills and challenging our assumptions. Also, keep an eye out for upcoming public programs on this topic. We are conducting teacher workshops on how to have critical conversations in the classroom, training educators how to create safe spaces for difficult conversations. We are providing classroom and educational support, top-notch educational resources, and engaging content for individuals of all ages and backgrounds. We are confronting anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all forms of racism and hate through our programs, educational resources, and trainings for teachers. Over the coming weeks and months, stay tuned for relevant and thought-provoking community programming, educational opportunities for teachers and students, and stories of the people doing great work in our communities to bridge ethnic, racial, and religious divides. One such person who stood up against the pressures, who saw beyond stereotypes and propaganda, was Marco Calvo, the main character of the book, We Are Not Strangers. Based on a true story, Marco, a Sephardic Jewish immigrant living in Seattle, developed a friendship with Sam Akiyama, a Japanese-American man. When Sam and his family were incarcerated during World War II, Marco stepped in to help. Jamie Ford, the best-selling author of the book Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, writes, "In every time of crisis and conflict, there are unsung heroes who demonstrate compassion, kindness, graciousness, and nobility. I'm grateful that Josh is sharing this one with the world." Sharon Hashimoto, author of The Crane Wife and More American, writes, "We Are Not Strangers inspires readers to treat fellow human beings with fairness and dignity. I couldn't imagine a more perfect book to discuss at this time." I'm so pleased to have with us author, artist, and designer Josh Tuninga. Josh lives with his family in North Bend, Washington, and after studying fine art at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, he founded an art and design agency where he continues to work as its creative director. His work has been published in Communication Arts Magazine and How Design Magazine, and he was awarded with the Communication Arts Award for Excellence in Illustration. Josh is the author of a couple of children's books, and We Are Not Strangers was awarded a For-Culture Heritage Grant, and it's his first graphic novel. We will have time to take questions from the audience at the end of the program. Please type in your questions at any time into the Q&A. Welcome, Josh, and thank you so much for being with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Alana, and thank you so much for setting up this event. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming out and you're interested in the book. Yeah, super excited to share this story with this community. that there may be some teachers in the audience, which I'm especially excited about because my publisher just released an accompanying education guide for the book, which just came out. And my dream is to have this book to be taught in schools. So very cool that there's some educators here in the audience. So yeah, so let me just share my screen here. Let's see here. It's going to take me 1 second. And should be good. Okay. So yeah, let me just get started here. So this project started in my Uncle Marco's West Seattle kitchen as he was making my family his fresh caught fish and chips. And as my uncle cooked his dinner, he told me the story of who arrived here in the Pacific Northwest in the early 1900s. Marco went on to tell me about attending his papu's funeral. It was a typical Sephardic Jewish event. Close family, friends, relatives he hadn't seen in years, so many familiar faces. But there were some people he didn't recognize at all. A handful of Japanese American guests had begun to arrive, and nobody knew who they were or why they came. And what Marco found out is that his papu had helped these families when they were forced out of the neighborhood and incarcerated during World War II. So his story only took a few minutes to tell me, but for the next few days, I just couldn't stop thinking about it. I just asked myself, how does a Jewish immigrant with family still overseas threatened by the Holocaust end up helping out his Japanese American neighbors here at home? Did they stay in touch after the war? Were there other similar stories like this? So I had a ton of questions. So I went back to interview my Uncle Marco. This is a drawing of him. And together we started to do some research to see if we could find out more about the story. We talked to our families and people from the old neighborhood to see if we could dig up some more details about his papu's history and find out what happened. I knew that Marco was named after his papu, Marco Calvo, a Sephardic Jewish immigrant. His papu had spent the beginning of his life on the small fishing island of Marmara, but the region was becoming very unstable for Jews at the time. So Marco and many other Sephardic Jews came to America in hope of a better life, and many of them arrived right here in the Northwest. I went into the Ellis Island immigration database and found his official immigration documents from when Marco Calvo immigrated to Seattle in 1902 or 1920. We knew that when he was young, he lived in the Central District and he worked at the Pike Place fishing markets, which at the time were primarily Japanese and Jewish owned. We knew that Marco Calvo owned and ran the Ferry Dock Tavern, which was at Pier 52 down by the waterfront. And we talked to several people who remembered him. So we were digging up all kinds of vague details here and there, but as the weeks went by, we just weren't getting that far. Seattle had changed a lot since the 40s, and the people who would have any more information about the story had died a long time ago. But I kept asking around and I talked to people. I kept hearing this name pop up in conversations. I'd hear, have you talked to Devin Narr? You got to go see Professor Narr at University of Washington. So I looked him up, and Devin is the professor of Sephardic Jewish Studies at University of Washington. I'm sure many of you have already heard about him. He's the author of many books about Sephardic Jewish history. So I decided to reach out to him and see if he had any advice for starting this project out. And he agreed to meet on campus. And that first meeting with Devin was when I realized that this project was about much more than just some family folklore. Professor Narr started talking about the parallels between the Sephardic and Sephardic Jewish and Japanese communities in Seattle. And I started to learn about the Seattle Central District, a place where immigrants and minorities who were blocked from living elsewhere had the opportunity to get to know each other as friends. And I started to learn about other stories of people who reached out to help their neighbors during the war. So at that first meeting, Devin gave me a ton of resources and information and encouraged me to start looking in deeper into my own family history. So word of warning, if you reach out to a historian for advice about an art project, they're going to give you a lot of homework. So when I first heard this story, I thought it was a simple story about a Jewish guy who helped out his neighbors. But once I started researching, it was clear that this story was about the type of environment that creates that kind of remarkable relationship. And I discovered these maps of the Seattle Central District, which kind of highlight how unique of an area it was. Um, you can see these maps. So these maps are based on a house-to-house survey conducted in 1939. You can see how there are concentrated neighborhoods, Sephardic Jews, Japanese. There are pockets of people where people lived, but they all kind of just overlapped each other. And yeah, so people of different backgrounds and cultures living right up against each other in this community. Um, so I should take a second and talk about Sephardic Jews. Most people that I've talked to that aren't Jewish that don't really know that the difference between the Jewish cultures. Actually, a lot of people who are Jewish don't really know. So yeah, so just really briefly, when most people think of Jewish culture, they think of matzo ball soup, speaking Yiddish. Those are Ashkenazic Jews, Jewish people originating from Central and Eastern Europe. And Sephardic Jews come from Spain, Portugal, and the Middle East. And the fundamentals of Judaism are the same, but they have different customs and foods. And this is something I was really excited about representing in my story because I've never really seen a story with a Sephardic Jew character in it. And so the main character of my story is based on my family history. And so Sephardic Jews who came from fishing islands in the Mediterranean. And those who immigrated to Seattle found opportunities in the fish markets at Pike Place Market. The fish markets were an opportunity to find work for immigrants who knew how to fish. And Pike Place Market was also a welcoming ground for Japanese community. Japanese markets at Pike Place thrived before World War II, and it's estimated that as many as 4/5 of the fishermen and farmers selling produce were Japanese Americans at that time. So as I learned about this strong connection between the Sephardic Jews and Japanese cultures, fishing obviously became a theme of my characters. But that wasn't the only thing these cultures had in common. And as I mentioned before, these communities lived in the central district, and because of redlining practices, they were blocked from moving elsewhere. So this unique community formed here, where people from diverse cultural backgrounds live closely together. Um, and as I started to dive deeper into this area, the history, I started thinking about my own memories from the CD. And so when I was a kid, we lived in the suburbs, but I used to tag along with my papu to the city to run errands all the time. And he loved to take me to the old neighborhoods and tell me about old stories about growing up in the CD. We usually take a detour, grab some dim sum or chipino at one of the fish markets. And he always seemed to know the owners wherever we went. He always just seemed to know everybody. And as a kid, I never really understood why we had to drive all the way into the city just to go to the bank or pick up some salmon for Passover but looking back, I think he just really wanted to stay connected with the community there. He was from a family of Sephardic Jewish immigrants, and most of his family had been wiped out during the Holocaust. And the Central District was a place full of people with similar backgrounds, and he felt really comfortable there. So when I started to do this project, my papu wasn't around anymore, but I decided to do exactly what we used to do together. So I jumped in my car and I headed to the city and I started exploring. And I started to do some drawing. So here's my first sketch of the original Sephardic Bikur Cholim synagogue in the Central District. Let's see, as I came across these like important landmarks and settings, I would snap some pictures, start sketching. This is the location of the real Ferry Dock Tavern, which Marco Calvo ran and owned. And this was a setting I used for many of my character scenes. And the more I kind of immersed myself into these different environments, I was really able to solidify the setting of the story. Um, I could put these important landmarks into the backgrounds of my scenes. This is Washington Hall. It's a historic public dance and music hall, which was the gathering place for many immigrant cultures. So reference material was a huge part of this process. Um, and that was the same when designing my characters. So I looked at a lot of old pictures some from old family photos, and others I found from the time period, which I used to help create the characters in the story. I started using some of the information I was learning about where our family came from in the artwork. And I used old newspaper headlines to set the time frame of some of my scenes. I use that kind of as a theme throughout the book to kind of orient the reader. Um, and so, and I also used a lot of reference photos I found online, and I started compiling images to draw from when creating these scenes. But excuse me, every once in a while, I would run into a character pose or a scene that I just couldn't find a reference for. And I had trouble envisioning in my head. So I would have my family pose for me. And I just wanted to show a couple of these now. They're kind of some fun photos of my family's constantly subjected to me rushing into their rooms, interrupting whatever they're doing, and forcing them to get into some strange pose. Um, I take their pictures to draw from, but a lot of times I'll come right back in and make them pose again from a different angle. And a lot of times I make them use props. It's kind of a funny picture. Um, and they have no context for what is happening or why, but I just wanted to show these as just kind of insight into the drawing process a little bit. Having live-in reference models makes my job a heck of a lot easier. Um, so in the same way that I rely on reference material for my artwork, the same goes for writing my scenes and storylines. I really wanted all the things that happened to my characters to come from, real stories, true stories or anecdotes I picked up along the way in interviews and archives. And one of the most valuable places for source material that I discovered throughout this whole process was densho.org. And so Densho is a Japanese incarceration archive based here in Seattle. And this is where I started to learn about what happened to the Japanese American community here in Seattle during the war. And I don't know how it was for all of you, but for me, I barely learned anything about this time period when I was in school. I mean, I learned a lot about the Holocaust, which was a big part of my education at home and in Hebrew school, and even in public school. But the incarceration camps were barely a small blip that we brushed over in history class. And what I definitely didn't piece together until working on this project is that these events were happening simultaneously. So the main character in We Are Not Strangers is faced with this dilemma. Um, as a Jew, he is relying on the US as an ally against the Nazis, while at the same time, his Japanese American friends and neighbors are being forced into camps right here in America. So this is something I hadn't even thought about. And when I discovered the Densho archive, I started to learn a lot of things that I had never heard before. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, 120,000 Japanese Americans were stripped of their rights and forced into camps under suspicion of disloyalty to the United States. Most people lost everything, including property, possessions, businesses. Two-thirds of those in prison were born right here in America. They were native-born American citizens. Not one prisoner was ever found guilty of any crime. And when they were released, they came home to virtually nothing and had to start their lives over from scratch. But there were these rare stories of people who reached out to help, and especially in communities where people from different backgrounds got to know each other as friends. And so there are stories of people who rented out their neighbors' homes for them and collected rent money to pay the mortgage, like in Marco's family story. And there are stories of people helping by keeping businesses afloat, storing people's possessions, caretaking properties, so that when they were finally released from the camps, their neighbors still had something to come home to. And so the more stories I learned about this, I could weave them into my narrative and with dialogue and images. So I spent a lot of time on Densho researching these stories, watching video oral history archives, getting source material. And eventually I decided to reach out to Densho for help, and they were absolutely amazing. Um, so the historians and staff at Densho provided multiple read-throughs, gave me feedback, and also pointed me in a direction for other resources to help me tell my story in more detail. So Densho was founded by Tom Akeda, who wanted to document and share World War II Japanese American incarceration history. Tom conducted over 250 video oral history interviews. Um, And so, yeah, and there's one interview he told me that I wanted to share. And that's the story of Aki Kurosi. So you may recognize the name. She was a well-known educator and peace activist. Um, and Seattle Public Schools honored her by naming a middle school after her. And in 1941, she was a 10th grader at Garfield High School in Seattle. And that's when Pearl Harbor was bombed, which in this interview, she recalls in great detail. And after the initial shock and chaos that followed, she remembers going back to school. And she remembers walking to class, and one of her favorite teachers approaches her and confronts her by saying, "You people bombed Pearl Harbor." And Aki talks about how threatened she felt and how up to that point she thought of herself as a normal American kid. She was popular, had tons of friends in the community, but suddenly she was thought of as the enemy. And this was one of the themes I wanted to really address in my book. I did keep asking myself, like, how is it possible that people's friends and neighbors in their own communities can so quickly turn into becoming their enemies? Um, and from what I've learned, that doesn't just happen out of the blue, right? Um, the media and the politicians, sometimes can promote this climate of fear and misinformation. We all know that sensational news sells. And during times of conflict, the narrative of dehumanizing groups of people and making them seem dangerous can spread very quickly. And these messages can be so powerful that it makes it really hard for people to go against the status quo. And that's why it's so rare that we hear stories of people reaching out to help. But one of the things that they talk about at Densho is the idea of bystanders and upstanders. And I know Alana, you just mentioned this as well. And the character in We're Not Strangers is an upstander. He goes against what he's being told and reaches out to his friend, find out how he can help, and work with him to create a plan. And this takes a lot of courage and compassion. And unfortunately, most people, however, are bystanders. They may know that something doesn't feel right. People aren't treated fairly, maybe, but most people choose to sit back and watch to see how things play out and not get involved. Um, so that's something I wanted to highlight as well, the power of reaching out to the people in our communities that are targeted as dangerous or treated unfairly, and see what we can do to help them. So I want to take just a few minutes to talk about the power of working with these organizations. So as you can probably tell, I learned a ton of information during the process of creating this book. As an artist, I'm usually so isolated, heads down in my own work. But when I reached out to University of Washington and Densho for help, it added so much to my story. Collaborating with historians and staff not only helped me make sure my story was accurate, which was really important to me, but they also provided inspiration for my storytelling and allowed this kind of story to grow. And it also created long-lasting relationships because, so Devin Narr at University of Washington, he ended up writing the afterword for We Are Not Strangers, which is a really fascinating work about Sephardic Jewish history, and the parallels between the Jewish and Sephardic communities. And I continue to work with Densho for events and resources just to stay educated. One of the other organizations that really helped me out was For Culture. For Culture is an arts and culture organization with grant and funding workshops, public art programs, and you've probably seen their logo around. I've never applied for a grant before, and they made an amazing experience. Helped me lay out a plan for the project and get initial feedback and encouragement. So if you're an artist or have a cultural project in the works, you definitely should check out For Culture grant opportunities. I also hooked up with Washington State Jewish Historical Society. They're similar to Densho in that they have amazing archives and resources and events. So they were a great resource for photos and history. And so if you're interested in Jewish history, definitely check them out. There were a ton of other organizations that helped with my research. Wing Luke helped me digging up some archival interviews. JCCCW also was a great resource. I've met with Washington Lawyers for the Arts to make sure I was getting my facts straight. As I was putting this slide together, I was like, wow, it really looks like I know what I'm doing, but like I'm a professional researcher or something, but this all really did just happen by accident. Every person I talked to along the way, from Devin all the way through the process, helped by pointing me somewhere else for resources. So I just kind of followed the leads. I also relied on conversations and feedback from local authors. Highly recommend these books. Special shout out to Ken Mochizuki, who wrote Baseball Saved Us. Um, he wrote the foreword for We're Not Strangers. So that was a really cool connection. So along with all this help from organizations and professional writers, I just want to talk about the face-to-face conversations I had with people, which added a lot to this project. So a lot of times in interviews, I would hear people mention an important landmark that I could incorporate into the background of one of my scenes. But sometimes my conversations with people would turn into a completely new chapter. So one example, I knew that the Sephardic Bihor Cholim Synagogue was an important Seattle Central landmark, but I didn't know what temple was like back in the 40s. And I asked around, and one of my mom's best friends, Debbie Wellner, had early childhood memories of going to synagogue. And she told us about the women's section in the balcony where people would gossip and shush each other during the services while the rabbi was trying to speak. So I used this as a foundation for one of my chapters. Another example of a conversation that led to a whole new chapter. We have a family friend, Linda Soyama, who owns the Azuma Gallery here in Seattle. It's amazing Japanese fine art gallery. So if you haven't been, you should definitely go check that out. It's an incredible place. So I went to visit the gallery and talked to Linda about my project, and she brought out these Japanese woodblock prints as we were talking. And the prince became the focal point for this scene of a daughter and father. His father's teaching his daughter about their family origins. Um, so the prince ended up being a unique way for my characters to discuss their family history. So there's one more example I want to talk about. So I kept hearing about Link's Tackle Shop from people I was interviewing, and it was a Japanese American owned store in a CD. And I thought the tackle shop would be a great setting for one of my scenes. So I got in touch with the owners, Jerry and Maria Beppu, who were nice enough to invite me into their house and conduct an interview. And I told them my story is about highlighting people who reached out to help their neighbors during the war. I just kind of mentioned that. And when they heard that, they both kind of just looked at each other and smiled. And so Jerry went on to tell me the story of his dad, an immigrant from Japan who struggled to make a living in Seattle. But before the war, his tackle shop was really starting to take off. And, he was getting popular. The family was feeling stable. One day, he takes his family up for a day of skiing at Snoqualmie Pass. And when they drove back into Seattle, they found out Pearl Harbor had been bombed. And it wasn't long after that they were forced to close the tackle shop and evacuate to Puyallup Fairgrounds Assembly Center, where they would be held for months before being put into permanent camps. After years living in the camps, the family returned home, and to their surprise, a Jewish insurance agent, a friend of theirs, had continued to pay their insurance premiums while they were away. And when the policy matured, the family received a payout and were able to reopen the Link's Tackle Shop. This insurance agent even checked up on the shop while they were gone and stored supplies for them. There's a lot more to this incredible story. I was able to record my interview with them, and it's available up on Densho Archive if you want to check it out. But this is just another example of the kind of stories I kept hearing about that I could weave into my story. So this book has been out for about a month now, and I keep getting asked why I think these stories are so relevant today. Well, there is a lot of ignorance and violence out there, as we unfortunately see in the news all the time, which affects these communities right here in our neighborhoods. And sometimes it feels like the cycle of conflict will just never end. I know I'm not the only one that has felt pretty hopeless, especially over the course of the past month. But these true stories of real people from different backgrounds working together and helping each other during uncertain times, I think we can all agree that's something we could use a heck of a lot more of these days. Sometimes it almost feels like we're encouraged to look at each other as strangers. And so I hope that the stories that I've highlighted in this book can act as a reminder it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Thank you very much.
Josh, thank you so much. I love when you are showing how you had your family pose for you, and then you are juxtaposing the pictures that you actually drew. That's fantastic to see them side by side like that.
Oh, that's great. That's great. I
Um,
kind of had forgotten about those and I just dug them up.
Really great. I have a few questions for you, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience to ask questions that they have. And I see some questions coming in through the Q&A. So please feel free, if you're watching, to add in your questions as we go. So Josh, I want to just back up a little bit and ask you, when did you first start creating comics and kind of finding your love for this sort of artwork?
Oh my gosh. Well, I have been drawing ever since I can remember. My dad is a fine artist, and I started drawing comics, I think probably just because I was seeing cartoons in the newspaper, well, the funny section. And so I started drawing cartoons. And me and my dad was kind of like, I don't know, is this really art? You know, the comics were pretty much the lowest form of literature that there was at that point, and compared to now as the graphic novel has grown. But yeah, eventually he really encouraged me, and I kept doing comics from there, did cartoons for the school newspaper, stuff like that, and just kind of kept at it. I did go to fine art, study fine art in college, but then I just kind of I came back to comics pretty fast.
Hmm. It's your artwork is wonderful, just the expressions that people have. And this is actually a good lead into my next question for you, which is, graphic novels and comics, they tell these stories in a way that's so different from just reading a narrative. And I'm wondering if you can talk about this a little bit, and how your book might be a different way of telling a story if I were just to write it out.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, it's kind of I think I get this question a lot, and I feel like for me, it's kind of like it's because I'm not a writer in general. I'm more of an artist, and then I've learned to become a writer to tell my stories visually. But I do think there's a lot of things you can do in a graphic novel that you can't do in a novel, and vice versa. One of the things, like, even I showed those newspaper headlines. I use like a lot of visual cues like that you can get a lot of information to your reader, and just a visual, just one panel that could take a lot more explaining to do. And like you said, like some of the expressions that, I mean, it's funny you mentioned that. People mention that a lot, and I catch myself when I'm drawing with the facial expression. Like when I'm drawing my characters, I'll catch sometimes my kids will even be like, "What are you doing with your face?" Or because I'm like almost like trying to make the face myself while I'm drawing it, kind of really get attached to what the fair characters are feeling. So yeah, I think a lot of that stuff you can convey visually. That is just a faster way to do that for the reader to convey that information. So there's a lot to it, but yeah.
Hmm. And of all the things you're trying to convey, what parts of the story did you find the hardest to convey in just the images or such limited text?
Yeah, I think the what I really that's why I really wanted to connect with some historians and some and researchers, and my goal with this story was to not have a single historian be able to look at this and be like, this isn't right or something like that. So that was my biggest challenge, was to just get my facts straight. Like I kind of mentioned, I was learning a lot of this stuff as I was researching it, and putting that into my story. So that was at first kind of overwhelming, but it turned out to be probably the most rewarding part of this project, was just connecting with those people, and going and writing and getting more feedback, and those interviews I had with real people that lived through these times. That was really, really, at first it was a challenge, but it just became like really, really fun and interesting. I kind of was like pretending I was a journalist at that point, and just like going around and getting more information. It was just really added a lot to the story.
Well, I love that you were able to interview some of the people who owned these shops, and that they in turn told you their memories and their stories of this time period. I feel like that just adds another layer to
Hmm.
the story.
Yeah, no, it really did. It really grew and grew. When I first started this story, I was like, oh, this could be a really small little comic I could get in The Stranger or Seattle Times, just something small. And as I talked to more people, it just kept, here's another chapter, and just growing. And so yeah, I didn't expect that to happen, but it just was really a really fun, really, it just really rewarding part of the project to see it happen like that.
So, what has the response been like from the people you interviewed and family members who have read this book, who know this story? What kinds of things have they told you? And I can only imagine there are probably now new people coming to you saying, I have something to tell you about.
That's definitely that's the thing I didn't expect as most. I mean, yes, obviously my family and friends well, the funny thing is I started this project 4 years ago in October. So when I first heard this story. And so, for years I've been talking about this project with my friends and family, and it's just kind of like at some point they're kind of like, I think they stopped listening because it's like it takes so long to do these things. It took me so long to draw this thing out. So that was kind of an unexpected thing when it finally comes out. Oh yeah, you're working on this. But you're right. There's, as I've had talks like this, I had a book launch event here in Seattle, and so many people come up with their stories and have something similar that happened or something that is related. And I'm telling you, like if I spend enough time with that person, I'm like, this could be a graphic novel right here, just this one person,
Mm.
right? And it's just like everybody has these stories, and that's just like, yeah, it's just really cool to see that connect with people and bring this stuff up, especially with all the stuff that's going on right now. I think people really just want to hear these stories. I think it's just makes them feel good about humanity right now.
Yeah, and I feel like, as you mentioned in your presentation, it's also just a reminder of this is one person who took an action that was available to him, that there was something he could do and he did it. And it wasn't
Mhm.
easy, but he did it anyway. And I think those stories are really inspirational right now when, as you mentioned, we all feel a little bit helpless with what's going on in the world.
Yeah, well, and this story is like it's kind of unbelievable how much, and there's similar stories like that where these people went to such great lengths. But you know, one of my biggest takeaways is, something super doesn't have to be such a giant, thing that you do for somebody. It can be literally just asking somebody how they're doing, that isn't being treated fairly right now. I mean, even things like I live in kind of a rural area. I'm out here in North Bend, Washington, and not everybody out here sees eye to eye and everything. And so, even just something with a sign on their property or whatever, my neighbors in my own community. And, I find that if I can still find some kind of common ground with them. And that just those little gestures, it's just that those little things go a long way. So it's like everything super small, just saying hi, how are you? How are you dealing with this right now? Up to, yeah, like and if they need help, like in Marco's story, it's just like, it's amazing where that can go.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like that, seeing other human beings as human beings, as individual people with all the complexities that we ourselves have also.
Mhm. Exactly.
Um, um, so Josh, what do you have planned for your next project? Are you going to write more about this subject or other subjects? And are there more graphic novels coming?
Well, maybe I really do. I have another couple projects in the works. One of them is more of a fiction story. It's very, very different. And then I have another story about just kind of a family story. But as this book has come out and I'm hearing more and more of these stories, I am kind of like, oh, maybe there is more that I can tell about this subject. But right now I'm kind of just taking a break from that and working on other things. But yeah, I mean, I definitely, if anybody has a story that they think I would like to hear, I always just say, don't hesitate to let me know because I'm definitely very interested.
Josh, you are opening yourself up to a flood coming.
Well, the flood's already kind of here, so I'm like, just keep it coming.
That's fantastic. I love it. I love that you're so open to hearing it because, I feel like we all have so much to learn and there's so many stories to tell.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Josh, there are so many questions coming in from audience members.
Okay.
I'm gonna redirect the questions now and start choosing a few to ask to you. And the main one that's come in several times is, where can people buy your book?
Oh, well, you can buy it anywhere books are sold. I think it's in bookstores everywhere. But if you're gonna buy it online, I mean, you can buy it on Amazon. But I tell people to go to bookshop.org is a great place to buy because you can buy it and it'll support your local bookstore like that's near you, and you can still buy it online. But or you can just buy it on Amazon. But yeah, it's I think it's available. That's my publisher says just say it's wherever books are sold. So it's out there.
That's great. And I know we had a number of teachers who were watching. Some of them had to jump off a little bit early to get back to their classes. But can you talk a little bit more about the teacher guide that you are working on, or maybe that's already complete?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can uh share that link with you and you can share that later. It
Yeah,
just came out and they had a couple educators work on it. And it's just great. If you haven't read the book, there's a lot of moments in the story where there's a lot of quiet moments in the story where people are just kind of reflecting on what's going on and you just kind of it's up to interpretation for the reader to kind of what and so some of those questions that are in the guide are like what is this character thinking right now, what do you think is going through their head, and like that stuff was really intriguing to me. But there's also like a lot of project ideas, uh, write a short comic about somebody in your school or community that you could reach out to and help, or just like a lot of little ideas like that. It's a really pretty comprehensive guide. It's like a 3 or 4 page document with like on this page, every page has like some sort of activity or idea around it. So but yeah, I'll definitely share that so that you guys can check it out.
very cool. That sounds amazing. I know we would love to see that, and I'm
Cool.
sure many others would also. And yes, if you send me the link, I'd be happy to post it when we post the video to this. I'll
Okay.
put the resource there too.
Okay, great. Well, and also if any teachers are here still, if you go to Abrams Comic Arts and just find my book there, the Educator's Guide is right there on the
Great.
page. So yeah.
So Josh, there's a question here from David who asks, why did you choose to write this story as fiction inspired by a true story?
Yeah, so it didn't that wasn't initially my plan. My plan was to just kind of make it as much of a true story as I could. But the every time I started learning about other people's stories, somebody be like, "Oh, this happened" or whatever. I'd hear another story. I'd be like, "Ooh, can I interject that somehow into my narrative?" And at some point, I was just like, "Yeah, I'm just going to keep doing that because it was just such rich information that I was getting, and I was getting a lot more information that I could have gotten just from this one story, just because." Like I said, not everybody who lived through that time is still around in my family and stuff like that. So the more information I could get, I could kind of weave it into this historical fiction narrative based on this true story. But every scene and every chapter is based on some sort of interview or something that I learned from someone. So I still think of it as a true story, but it's just the narrative and the characters and stuff like that I fictionalized just to like make it tie it all together.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Um, so Jennifer asks, what age group is this book the best for? Like if she wanted to donate it to a school library,
Yeah.
what level would you recommend?
That's a great question. I keep getting asked that. I think my initial answer is like middle school on up, but you know, I mean, I think Devin's planning to teach this in his curriculum, and he's at the academic college level. But and also, I've had a couple people be like, "Oh, my fifth grader read it and they loved it." So I really think it depends on the kid. I think that when my kids first read their first draft, they were in like seventh grade, and I think that hit pretty good because they've already learned a little bit about World War II. And I think having a little bit of that pre-education is good probably for this book. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I think it depends on the kid.
Yeah, I mean, and the book is certainly multi-layered. It's like I wouldn't be deceived by the fact that it's a graphic novel, because really it's, about a very serious topic. So it's like it has those multiple layers to it.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's funny that there's still almost the stigma of a graphic novel is still not quite, it's like if anybody still thinks it's just a bunch of superheroes getting in silly fights with each other, it's a lot more than that right now. I mean, even like, I think there the book has a area where it's like I go into a lot of the historical landmarks and a little bit more of the history and yeah, I think that's more directed towards probably a bit like older audience. So, but that's just there and accessible for that if needed. So.
Um, so William asks, your artwork looks amazing. I love the characters and your drawings of an urban setting, and I agree this is a great subject matter with a very current message. Have you considered syndicating this as a serial comic in newspapers?
Oh my gosh, I'll have to ask my publisher about that. I don't know. I don't know. That would be amazing. Um, like I said, I kind of originally thought maybe that would be how it would be, but then it just kind of grew into a full-blown graphic novel with this national release. So yeah, I don't know if what the ins and outs of that are, but that would be really neat. I've definitely seen work like that where it just kind of comes out in small bits and then comes together at the end. So that could be cool.
Okay, Josh, here's my last question for you coming from the audience. And because this has come in a couple times also, please tell us about where you are joining us from. Somebody wants to know, is this a school bus you're sitting in?
Oh my gosh, it is. This is my studio. This is where I work. This is my, oh, there you go. That's kind of the hallway down to the entrance. Yeah, so this is where I work. It's a old converted school bus that I have parked on the side of my property here in North Bend. I got it when my kids were super small. We live in kind of a small house, and I was like, I have my workout, and it's always just getting drawn on and messed up or whatever. So I was like, I need a place to work, and I thought about doing like a small outbuilding or something like that. And then this thing popped up on Craigslist actually from an old Burning Man guy who's had hopes to get it running and drive it down to Burning Man. So I had it towed here and I gutted it and I got a little wood stove here to keep me warm. And so yeah, this is my spot.
Oh my gosh, that's fantastic. Um, well, I want to thank you, Josh. I want to thank our amazing audience for all of the questions you've been sending in. I'm sorry if I didn't get to all of them. We'll make sure to try to reach out to Josh. And I know some of you have said you'd like him to come present or you'd like to use his book in various places. I think that's amazing. This book has so many possibilities for ways it can be used, and it's such a great educational tool for adults, students, for everyone. The story is really remarkable and the artwork is fantastic. So we'll make sure to make all these connections, and Josh, I'll put you in touch also with some of the people who are making the comments as well.
That would be great. Yeah, this book just came out, and so I'm just kind of getting started with events and stuff, and I'm very excited about any events that people are interested in. So that'd be great.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I also just want to give a special shout out to Rabbi Jim Morrell, who connected us when even before Josh's book was released to let me know this was coming. So thank you, Rabbi Morrell.
Thank you, Rabbi Morrell.
And
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Josh.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
I want to thank the Bainbridge Island Japanese American Exclusion Memorial Association for their support of this program. I hope you can join us this Sunday at 2:00 p.m. at the Holocaust Center to hear about another incredible story. This one is the survival story of Aryeh, whose family escaped Nazi-occupied Poland for the Soviet Union, where he and his family became part of a migrant labor force and were sent to various labor camps as far as Siberia. You can find more information on that on our website. And all of our programs and work at the Holocaust Center are possible because of our generous supporters. So if you want to be part of this work, donations of all sizes make a difference and help us to do even more of what we're doing. There's a link in the chat where you can donate, and we couldn't do this work without you. And of course, we couldn't do this work without our incredibly dedicated staff, our CEO, Dee Simon, Richard Green, our technology director who helps to run these Lunch and Learn programs, and a special thank you to our entire staff, Paul Regelbrug, Jessica Michaels, Brand Anderson, Lori Werschel-Cohen, Morgan Romero, Lexi Jason, Amanda Davis, Katie Lawrence, Michael Langberg, and Olivia Teague. I'm wishing you all safety and security. Thank you so much for joining today's program. We hope to see you at future events. This concludes our program for today.